One of the most fascinating properties of everyday language processing is the variability between the speech sounds and the meaning that is conveyed in speech. So recall, for example, your last family vacation. Your grandfather's slow, low-pitched voice sounds completely different from your younger cousin's fast, high-pitched voice, and yet you usually have no problem understanding the contents of the speech as well as the emotional and pragmatic meanings of it. And how we can do so, or how we can resolve the lack of invariance in the sound meaning mapping, has been one of the most significant questions for the past 40 years of speech perception research. Acoustic features of vowels are probably the best known examples, where the vowel spaces vary according to the talker's age, gender, and other physiological features. What we hear as the same sound is in fact produced with highly different acoustic details between female and male speakers. But you can also see large crosstalker variability in consonants. As an example, here are some feature distributions for voiced and voiceless stop consonants in English. And more recent studies have begun to document crosstalker variability in prosody as well. So just to give you an example, here I'm showing you some production data. Speaker A was asked to produce multiple sentences of the form "it's Xing," such as "it's raining," once as a statement and once as a question. Those intonation contours are grouped and plotted here. His statements and questions are all pretty similar within their groups, and the main difference between the groups is that his questions rise in pitch on the end. However, Speaker B's productions vary a lot, both within and between these meaning categories. As you can see, because of the talker differences, the same meaning is encoded through extremely different intonation contours, and at the same time, very similar contours are produced under the two different meanings across the speakers. These two talkers are by no means just hypothetical examples or edge cases. Just to illustrate, we measured for each person how much pitch went down for statements and how much it went up for questions. These are what you get for one person. And now we're going to do a mental rotation. Now I'm plotting them along this horizontal dimension where the final pitch is more likely to rise for questions and fall for statements. Again, these are the distributions in one person, but when we collect data from more people, we do see a substantial amount of crosstalker variability. We're up to 40 speakers now, 50 speakers, 60 speakers. What we see is a distribution of overlapping distributions. This is after normalizing the baseline pitch and speech rate differences. In other words, each individual talker has their unique distributional patterns in the production of prosody. This substantial overlap means that if I play you a particular token of an intonation contour, the signal itself does not tell you whether it was meant to be a question or a statement, which creates a large amount of uncertainty. So the fundamental question we need to ask is, what do listeners do? In other words, how do listeners map such a variable phonetic signal onto a finite set of phonological categories that can generalize across talkers and contexts? Today, we hope to address this question from the perspective of adaptive perception of prosody with a special focus on how stable that adaptation may be. So what is prosodic adaptation? One key idea in the study of speech perception is that listeners have expectations about the acoustic and phonetic cue distributions over prosodic categories. This theoretically helps with talker-specific categorization of input. In the case of question-statement prosody, this involves some clear statements like this.
It's cooking.
Some clear questions like this.
It's cooking.
And some items that are initially quite ambiguous between the two.
It's cooking.
When a listener realizes that a particular person's questions sound a little bit like statements, the listener can shift or adapt their question category in this direction. And if the person's statement prosody sounds a bit like a question, they can adapt their expectation in the other direction so they can reduce the ambiguity and miscategorization. One question that is less well understood is how long this type of adaptive shift can last. A classic study by Eisner and McQueen tested this with a phoneme adaptation task using an FS fricative continuum. They found a robust maintenance of adaptation after 12 hours of both wakefulness and sleep. A few more recent studies have found some evidence of maintenance up to 1 week. Understanding the stability of adaptation is important for at least 2 reasons. First, functionally, adaptation would be particularly taxing and inefficient if you had to adapt to the same talker all over again each time you talk to them, especially for someone you talk to frequently, like your friends and family members. We need to understand how much and what information can be stored so that exposure can accumulate over time. Second, and theoretically, robust maintenance of adaptation suggests that it's supported by some form of learning mechanism rather than just simple priming or transient activation, as has been suggested by some theories. However, the body of work in this domain is still small, and no study has ever tested intonational prosody. To this end, in the current study, I will first report on a single session experiment that investigates how quickly and flexibly listeners adapt to an ambiguous statement or question prosodic contour, and then I'll present on a 2-session experiment to investigate the stability of that adaptation. So we set out to test this by creating an 11-step prosodic continuum that ranges from a very clear statement to a very clear question. I'm going to play you a few examples of this so you can hear when it shifts from a statement to a question for you.
It's cooking, it's cooking, it's cooking, it's cooking, it's cooking, it's cooking.
We played these to 60 native listeners of American English and asked the question, is this person asking you a question or making a statement? Here I'm showing you the 11 steps of the continuum on the x-axis and the proportion of question responses on the y-axis. As expected, step 1 was almost categorically understood as a statement, and step 11 was understood as a question almost 100% of the time. And step 6 was indeed quite ambiguous between the statement and question meanings. Based on these stimuli, we created a paradigm with 3 phases: a pre-test, a 4-minute training, and the post-test. Let me walk you through the logic of the paradigm and our predictions. The initial and final tests are actually identical. Just like in the norming study, subjects listened to the 11-step continua and responded whether a given item is a question or a statement in a randomized order without any feedback. So we predict to see something similar to what we saw in the norming study. Next, subjects were randomly assigned to one of 2 between-subject training conditions: question biasing or statement biasing. In the training phase for the question biasing condition, subjects continued to make question versus statement judgments 30 more times. There were 2 types of stimuli. 15 of them were unambiguous statements.
It's losing.
And they received feedback after each of them saying that it was a statement. They also heard 15 instances of ambiguous items.
It's moving.
And received feedback saying that it was actually a question. So the idea is that these ambiguous items fall in the middle of the 2 underlying categories. By giving them the feedback that they're actually questions, we wanted to expand the question category. If subjects can learn it, in the final test, where they hear the same items they heard in the initial test, there should be more question responses overall. In the statement biasing condition, the procedure was the same, but the types of stimuli were switched. 15 of them were unambiguous questions. We're going to try that again for audio. 15 of them were unambiguous questions.
It's losing.
And they received feedback after each of them saying that it was a question. They also heard 15 instances of ambiguous items.
It's moving.
And received feedback saying it was actually a statement. So again, the idea is that these ambiguous items fall in the middle of the 2 underlying categories. But this time, we give them feedback that they're actually statements, and we want to expand the statement category. If subjects can learn it, in the final test, there should be fewer question responses overall. If adaptation is successfully induced, in the post-test, the lines should move in opposite directions from each other. And that's what we found. After only 4 minutes of exposure, listeners show robust adaptation of their categorization to this talker's prosody. Just to compare, step 6 was about 50% in the pretest. In the post-test, the same exact tokens were categorized as a question 75% of the time in one condition and 25% in the other condition. So people's judgments completely flipped. Now, one key question that we set out to ask was how much exposure it takes to induce the adaptation. To answer this, here we're plotting data from the training phase. The x-axis shows the trial number, and the y-axis shows the average percent correct responses. Remember that in the training phase, each participant heard and received feedback on both an unambiguous and an ambiguous token. In the question biasing condition, the unambiguous token was a statement, step 1, and in the statement biasing condition, it was a question, step 11. In both conditions, accuracy for the unambiguous tokens started and remained high for the duration of the training phase. In both conditions, again, participants heard ambiguous tokens as well, with either question feedback or statement feedback. Innately, these actually were ambiguous. Here's the data. Accuracy starts around chance, but it quickly rises near ceiling and stays there. Practically, the adaptation occurs as quickly as within the first 10 tokens of exposure, and that is usually less than a minute of time. So based on these results, we asked the second question: how long does the adaptation last once it's triggered? Is this something people do in this weird experiment and then forget once they're done with it? Or do people actually maintain some knowledge so they're able to use it when they see the same person a second time? To ask this, we invited participants back to the same pre-test, training, and post-test procedure after some amounts of delay in between. Initially, a total of 424 participants completed the first session and returned to the same experiment after 3 days, 5 days, or 7 days. Each participant took part in the same between subject bias condition as they were in on the first day. So let me first show you the results from the 3-day delay condition. As I've said before, in the pretest, participants' categorization of step 6 was roughly 50-50, which in the post-test moves in the direction corresponding to the feedback. So what happens when people return to the experiment? Here we can think of 2 possibilities. If the adaptation is lost after the 3 days of delay, the pretest categorization functions for session 2 should be pretty identical to those from session 1. Alternatively, if they retain some adaptation, they should already be pulled apart from each other. And that's what we found in session 2. Listeners in the 2 conditions provided clearly different responses, suggesting the maintenance of adaptation. This is pretty surprising. For example, since you've been listening to my speech for more than 4 minutes already, if you see me in 3 days, your comprehension is already calibrated to how I personally use prosody. And this can be a really powerful mechanism for navigating talker variability in speech sounds. Now, in order to compare the results with those from the 5-day and the 7-day delay conditions, I'm going to summarize the data of the 3-day condition by taking the mean rate of question responses across the 11 steps. For instance, the mean question rate in the pretest of session 2 of the question biasing condition was 53.1%, and it was 41.8% in the statement biasing condition. Once we do that, we can visualize the trajectory of adaptation and its maintenance in a more straightforward manner. During the first session, in the training, participants rapidly increase and decrease, respectively, their mean question rate in categorization in response to the training. The separation between these 2 points shows the degree of adaptation. And when they come back to the second session, they maintain the shift without much decay. And to our surprise, we found more or less the same results after a delay of up to 5 days. If they finished their first session on a Friday, for example, when they came back on the following Wednesday, they still maintained the adaptation effect And that served as the starting point for the adaptation during the second training phase. And again, we found the same results after a full week of delay in between. This means that the rapid adaptation from a few utterances had a lasting impact despite hundreds and thousands of intervening utterances that each listener must have heard in between while going about their days during the delay. So as excited as we are with these results, we're left with a question. How is this possible? Do we actually remember all speech patterns of all talkers we meet? So we're aware of the possibility that this could be a byproduct of this experimental paradigm. One possibility is that the participants formed an explicit simplifying rule. The current task had a clear forced choice structure with very explicit feedback after each response during training. This could have encouraged participants to adopt a strategy along the lines of, if I hear an ambiguous sound, I should respond that it's a question or that it's a statement, depending on the bias. Such explicit encoding could be similar to the conscious memorization of words, which makes the week-long maintenance less surprising. We do have ongoing work addressing if listeners may retain adaptive shift even if the feedback is more implicit and doesn't readily support the explicit memorization of the input. For instance, we embed an ambiguous contour into a conversation where the interlocutor's response disambiguates the intended meaning. For instance, the response, "I don't know," only really makes sense if the original utterance was a question. So the conversation, "It's raining, I don't know," is a little weird. If the current results replicate with this less explicit, more ecologically valid feedback, we'd be more confident that the rapid and stable adaptation occurs in our real-world communication as well. But even with explicit feedback, a week of maintenance is remarkable, in particular because the participants only knew that they would need to come back to a second session, not what they would have to do in the second session. Also, our training items and test items had different words and therefore different segmental information. So this means at the very least that listeners naturally stored the prosodic information and could generalize it to another item after a week if they needed to do so. This supports the idea that each episode of online language processing is not an isolated instance. Rather, it's likely shaped by a lot of context-rich exemplars and past experiences of talker-specific adaptation. So to answer our original question of what listeners do to cope with the substantial variability in the prosodic signal, we've shown that rapid and long-lasting adaptation can help them tune into a talker-specific pattern of prosody meaning mapping. Given that the malleability of comprehension has been found at multiple levels of human sentence comprehension, the current results open up a new, important question about how long these adaptive shifts might last and how the longevity might vary across different levels of processing. And, perhaps more critically, we need to better understand, we need to better understand what kinds of memory mechanisms might support these competing demands of flexible and stable language comprehension, and how the brain efficiently forgets irrelevant information to support the longevity of these adaptive changes. That's all I have. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Vellante Vanderbilt. This was an incredible talk. I have to up my game when it comes to giving PowerPoints. You did a really great job. And you touched on it a little bit at the end, but I'm wondering how you think this disambiguation works in more complex sentence structures, or when the ambiguity of a sentence might be higher due to the length of the conversation that is happening, or might even be lower due to the length of the conversation that's happening, because then you have more context clues coming in from different things. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we haven't tested anything like that, so I'm speculating here. But I think as long as it gets disambiguated and it gets disambiguated consistently, like as we see individuals tend to have a relatively bimodal distribution of statements and questions for their own productions, even if it's not overall. I think if it gets disambiguated somehow, that we would still probably adapt to it, right? Because we don't in everyday conversations, just anecdotally at least, we don't have too much trouble understanding most of the time whether someone is telling us something or asking a question. We can figure that out. So I think the adaptation would still occur.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question that's related to some of the issues you brought up at the end, right? About how this generalizes or doesn't generalize to the broader situation. And I think we're all working under a view of memory where memory is highly influenced by context, right? Context effects on memory, and also gated or linked to particular situations. And you chose throughout to interpret this in the most ecologically valid way. This was what you were learning about a speaker. But I guess I'm wondering about two things, right? It could be what you're learning about a situation, this experimental situation. And I don't mean this in the sense that, this makes it artificial. Like, that's how memory works. Maybe we learn in particular contexts that people talk particular ways. And so I guess I want you to say a little bit about what allows you to say that this is particular to an individual speaker, or what you could do that would show that. And then also maybe to speak to something in your data that to me suggests maybe a broader situational explanation, which is that if anything, it got stronger at 7 days relative to 5 days. What I know about most people's lives is that all the things that they were doing tend to run on a weekly cycle, particularly students. And I'm wondering if this just speaks to very broad and loose context effects rather than particular speaker effects. Interesting.
Yeah. So for the second question, I don't know if we, the 7 days version, it doesn't show up immediately. I didn't notice initially that it seemed to get stronger. I don't know if that's a statistically significant thing that we found. I'm not sure if it does get stronger, but I agree that on a weekly basis, because this is what I thought too. Initially, we were very surprised that it lasted for a week, and then I was also thinking along the lines of, if you see someone after a week, in schedule, you're probably good, that happens a lot. It's not that long. Can you remind me of your first question, please?
What allows you to say this is speaker-specific adaptation?
Speaker-specific adaptation, yeah. So we've done a couple of related studies that I haven't presented on here that had 2 talkers. So there weren't delays built in as such, but we had a male talker and a female talker biased in different directions, and they were able to at post-test differentiate between them. So they retained the correct bias for the right person. They didn't muddle them together. So, yeah. Okay, cool.
Hi, Sarah. Excuse me, Sarah Phillips at Georgetown. Also thought that your talk was interesting. I think the question that you were just asked about whether this was speaker specific was a part of my question, but I think another part of my question is when you're thinking about maybe this idea of readaptation being kind of costly in the context of maybe memory consolidation actually being a way of maybe helping you, and the fact that you would consolidate information in a way that you could store it as a representation, whether it be an individual or of a context. So my question is my follow-up question would be, what happens if you do pre and post tests same day? So they don't have a chance to sleep, they don't have a chance to really do what we would think about when we think about memory consolidation, where you would have a night to sleep or a couple of nights to sleep, or even in the context of a week to sleep. Do you still think that you would see adaptation effects? And then relatedly, if you were to do this same kind of a paradigm, both same day as well as over multiple days, if you were to do pre and post tests on different speakers, would they generalize across different speakers? If there were other cues that would make them seem comparable?
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so for the first question, we actually have a pre and post test on the same day in the works. We haven't analyzed that yet, so I don't have any actual data to report on. But in previous studies of segmental adaptation, they have been able to remember it. So I think we would still see that adaptation for sure. Maybe it wouldn't be as heightened perhaps because of consolidation, but I think it would still be there. Second question. Sorry, can you remind me of the second question?
Yeah, so this is kind of in continuation. So you talked about a male versus female speaker, but what if you had 2 different speakers, they were both male and female? Would people generalize because there was something maybe other acoustically similar between your talkers?
Would would people generalize because there was something similar between the talkers? That's a good question. I don't know if we have anything in particular.
Okay.
As long as they are prosodically similar, especially within the same gender group, it's not strictly focus specific.
So it's not strictly token specific, but they do seem to make these generalizations within gender if they're prosodically similar. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amanda Rissling. I'm at UC Santa Cruz. Nice to meet you. I have, I guess, a worry, and I'm hoping maybe you can help me. When I hear your midpoint stimuli, those that are supposed to be halfway between a statement and a question, they sound kind of rude to me.
Oh,
Right?
okay.
In fact, they sound like things I would produce only to someone that I'm very close to. And it would come out something like, "It's raining, duh."
Yeah.
Right? And so in that case, like, why would you do that? It would be because someone had probably asked you something that was a little too obvious. Or
Yeah.
maybe because you were trying to be like, are we not living in the same world right now? This obvious thing, right? But that I think becomes a concern. Because I can very quickly label those intermediate steps as like that kind of sarcastic or that kind of rude, that kind of like it's obvious thing.
Yeah.
And if a person can label that for themselves, right, then I'm worried that your implicit task may not still be answering, like your implicit learning that you're doing later on, right, that you're now trying, or your implicit teaching of them. I'm worried that it's still gonna be the case that you're gonna have participants who can go, yeah, that kind of ruder thing, which has some of the force of both a question and a statement.
Yeah.
Well, here I'm being told I should just call it a question. Or here I'm being told I should just call it a statement.
Yeah.
Right? Because of that labelability. And so if that is what you have going on, I'm a little worried on your behalf that this isn't the kind of adaptation we see if we're thinking about like that kind of phonemic thing. That like ephemeral, I can't produce something on command that's between an E and an oo, right? The like targets are so strong in my head that I can't go there.
Yeah.
And so that kind of implicit adaptation that you get from phonemes, where it's been shown that you can tune one ear one way and another ear the other way in the same listener, right? I'm worried that you're dealing with something kind of very different because of the conscious labelability. And I wonder if you, maybe it's a comment, but I wonder if you've thought about any of this and maybe you can assuage some of my concern.
Yeah, that's, thank you for that. That's a very cool thing to bring up. I don't know if I have any thoughts about that specifically. Like, we know that question and statements aren't the only prosodic contours we can produce. So this is a little bit of a simplified version of a much more complex problem. But like, even one of the participants told me that the ambiguous contours, like, not in a rude sense per se, but in a very, like, over-the-top kind of way. Like, was very strongly a statement to her, like even more strongly than like the prototypical statements were. And she described something like vaguely similar to what you were saying of like it, like I know what I'm supposed to learn, but it still like really sounds like this to me, so that is a concern. But yeah, but this is a simplified version of the problem. That's a great thing to include in future versions of it. Thank you.
Okay. Jia Lu, University of Pennsylvania. I mean, you're conveniently on this slide, so I'm actually curious about the overshoot in the pre-post test several days after. So it's pretty impressive that the adaptation actually occurs as rapidly as like within 3 or 4 trials, and it sort of plateaus in the previous figure you showed. So on one hand, you have that in the training phase in the first session, the classification actually plateaus after 3 or 4 trials and stays pretty constant. And then I think just from eyeballing, if you go like one step further on this slide and show, you can, yeah. So I think just from eyeballing, it seems like after several days of decay, and then you have people go through the same training, they're able to overshoot and go beyond the plateau that the training sort of asymptotes at in the first session. So I'm just wondering, like, first of all, is my eyeballing accurate? And if so, what do you think might be happening?
Yeah, so the eyeballing, well, I will say part of the reason this particular plot may be a little confusing is that these lines are going in different directions. So, like, as you get closer back towards the center of the plot, that's where decay happens. So The question biasing, like it decays a little and then goes back up to where it had been at
And maybe
post-test
beyond.
before. Maybe beyond.
Yeah,
I haven't
so that's the
checked if
beyond
it's-
part. That's quite curious.
Yeah, I haven't checked if it actually is fully beyond. If it is, that might be potentially indicative of like maybe another prosodic category that they're deciding this is falling into now. Like,
But, yeah, probably, and it will be curious why they didn't do that in the first training session.
yeah, that's really interesting. That's something to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.